we would rehearse for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, and we did that for 4 months before the tour started. So and yeah, he definitely wanted to hear the songs played properly, which I totally understood, and he was always real clear about that he was paying musicians to play his music. That was our job. So I didn't have any illusions about that, and as far as I was concerned, I wanted to play the songs over and over again until they sounded perfect. It was a pleasure for me to try to play the songs perfectly, or because I loved the music so much and I wanted Frank to be happy. So he always said that he considered it his relationship to the rest of the musicians in the band to be the boss, and because he was the boss, you wanted to make sure that he was happy with the job you were doing. So I was totally fine with that, but it wasn't like it was a struggle, or at least it wasn't for me, because I loved the music. And we spent a lot of time laughing, especially in the early days of rehearsal. We rehearsed for 4 months before the tour began. And as hard as we were working, we were also having a really good time. And that was when I was most happy, when Frank found something so funny that he would just laugh really loudly. So that, a lot of the time, that was the object, to entertain Frank to the point where he just would start laughing uncontrollably. So we had a really good time at the same time that we were getting a lot of work done.
Yeah, actually, well, that's a question that I got in mind, because somehow when we had this discussion here, there was somehow an idea that none of the musicians really got close to Frank Zappa, that he really didn't really make friends with musicians. But is that really right? It doesn't sound right by what you tell.
Frank will always, he wouldn't use words like friends. that concept just, I don't think, was very interesting to him. But he really liked having a good time, and I know that he enjoyed the camaraderie of a band. And he, it's depending on what was going on. If the band wasn't playing well, then maybe he could be a little bit of a stern taskmaster. But if everything was flowing and the band was into it, then Frank would be having a great time. And some of the most fun that I had with Frank during rehearsals was during dinner break, and we would just go out to dinner together. And so that was away from work, and we were just relaxing and eating, and he was telling stories, and we were laughing and having a good time. And it was very friendly, even if he wouldn't use the word friends, we were doing things that friends would do, and we were having a good time. So it was, and Frank had great affection for, certainly, some members of the band he felt very, very close to. I know that he really felt a connection with Scott Tunis, for instance, which was, why when some people in the band weren't happy with Scott, that Frank was inclined to support Scott, because he, I think he felt a real warmth towards Scott, and all of Scott's, the way Scott viewed life and the way he viewed music and all of it. Frank felt a connection with that. So he definitely formed connections with certain people. And I know that he had great love for Ike as well, just because of the fact that Ike could totally, crack up Frank in the middle of a song and make him forget his lyrics. All these things were very enjoyable for Frank. And that was, and that's why it became so sad for him when the feeling in the band started to get, really unhappy, and that affected Frank's mood towards the end of the European tour. So that's, I think, even aside from the fact that Frank was not physically well at the time, although he didn't know yet how unwell he was, but it was also because he had stopped laughing. And at the point that he stopped laughing, I think he lost interest.
So the last tour was also a sad one for everyone, in a sense.
Yeah, well, I mean, it started out wonderfully, but then it did get sad, especially at the towards the end of it. I seem to recall that especially there were a run of dates in Italy where Frank just was not in a good mood, and normally we would spend 2 hours in the afternoon at sound check, not just checking the sound but also running tunes, and maybe learning something new that Frank had just written on the bus, or on an airplane or something, or changing arrangements and being very creative. Those 2 hours during the middle of the day produced a lot of material that we ended up playing on stage. But then when we got to Italy, and the feeling in the band wasn't so happy, Frank started just showing up to sound check and doing the bare minimum of work required to make sure that everything on stage was working. And we would run the same sections of 5 songs at every day in a row, make sure the vocals sound good, the guitars sound good, the horns sound good, all that stuff. And then Frank would just take off his guitar and leave, so that instead of doing 2-hour sound checks, we were doing like 15-minute sound checks, and then it would be done. So that was sad for me, because I just it was my first tour. I was really young, and I couldn't understand why there was this unhappiness. And as far as I was concerned, it was a miracle to be on the road and on stage playing Frank's music. I felt very fortunate, and I thought, well, this is an opportunity that very few people have. We should be seizing this opportunity and trying to keep the spirits in the band high, and therefore keep Frank's spirits high. And I was so young. There was a lot about life and human relationships that I didn't understand yet, so there was a lot of dynamics that were just beyond me. But I was, it made me sad that we couldn't sort of keep it together.
Okay.
And then we were supposed to do another 10 weeks of dates in the US, and those ended up getting canceled, and that was it was very sad at the time.
I would like to turn to the other side of how of this time with you with Zappa. We have been talking about auditioning. But how did you end up? What was your entering to the band?
It came about because I had just made a phone call to Frank's office. Oh, I like your Halloween boxes up there on the shelf. That looks good. I had called Frank's office because I had heard that he was in rehearsal with a new band, and that was in late 1987. And after the 1984 tour, Frank had lost so much money, he swore that he was never going to tour again. So when I heard that he was putting a new band together, I got very excited and actually called the office and offered my services. And I had no professional experience as a musician at all. So it was very, I didn't think there was any chance of succeeding, but I thought I better take the chance at least. So I called the office and said that I played guitar and keyboard and I sang, and I was familiar with all of Frank's material, and I knew how to play a lot of it, just in case he needed anybody. I wanted him to know that I existed. And then Jerry, who worked in the office, called me back the next day and said, no, it wasn't Jerry who called me. It was Jerry who passed the word on to Frank that he had gotten the call. And then the next day I got a call from Frank, and he just said, so you know how to play all my music? And I said, well, I'm familiar with all of it. And he said, do you know how many songs that is? And I said, yeah, they're all in the next room. And he said, I don't believe you. Get your ass up here and prove it. And he just he just thought that I must have been lying. But it wasn't the thing where I could play any Frank Zappa song perfectly from memory. It was just that I had listened to them over and over and over again. I had taught myself to play a lot of them. I had a good ear, so if a song was in my memory, it was pretty easy for me to figure out how to play it. If you just give me a minute, I'll figure out most of the chords and pretty much be able to play it for you. So that's what he wanted to test. On the phone, he said, learn Sinister Footwear 2 and learn What's New in Baltimore, and then come up here and play them for me. And then I'll just run you through all the other stuff that we're rehearsing. So I got up there and I played those songs for him, and I played them pretty good, well enough to demonstrate that he could tell me on Monday to learn what's new in Baltimore, and on Tuesday I would be able to present some sort of version of it, and then give me another week and I'll have it down. And then so he just started naming songs at the audition, and I would say, well, give me a minute, and I would call it up from my memory and play it for him. And it was, I think it was sort of like I was a new toy that Frank could name a song and then wind it up and watch him play it. So it was fun for me to provide that role. And it was, I think, Frank could see the benefits of it, and he had me play some keyboard, and he was checking my sight reading of music, which is not that great. So at one point he put up the score for Strictly Gentile on a keyboard, and I was playing the keyboard and looking at the score. But I wasn't playing the score. I was playing it from memory, but I was looking at the score as though I was reading it. And Frank couldn't really sight read either. He could write music all day, but he couldn't sight read. So he's looking at the score and he's looking at my fingers and he's kind of going back and forth. And he's go, wait a second, are you playing the score, or are you just playing it by ear? And I said, oh, I'm playing it by ear. And he was entertained by that. And so at the end of the rehearsal, he shook my hand and said, because the band wasn't there. It was this huge rehearsal space. The only people in the room were Frank and me and my brother, Marty, who had driven me to the audition so I could play guitar in the back seat for 2 hours. And so, Frank shook my hand and said, come back on Monday so the rest of the band can witness your particular splendor, is what he said. And I thought, I couldn't believe it. My brother and I just screamed in the car all the way home. It was unbelievable, because the week before I was playing George Michael songs in a bar the size of my fist, and then a week later I was, Frank invited me to join his band. It was ridiculous.
Thank you. Yeah, I remember. Well, I read like the interview of Frank, like 1988, where I first saw your name too. I remember he mentioned that you came to the studio and played Night School and only played one note wrong. So.
Yeah, that was one that I had taught myself because I loved that melody so much. And so at the audition, he was naming a lot of songs. He was saying, play We're Turning Again. I remember he said, play the Studebaker Hawk section, or sing the Studebaker Hawk section of Billy the Mountain, because he wanted to see if I could sing that he could be a dog or a frog or a lesbian queen. And, he wanted to see if I could decode the pattern of that melody, because it's rising up in fourths. He could be a dog or a frog, and then it goes up a whole step and then comes down in a different set of fourths. So and I remember this because he asked me to sing that, and I was like trying to hit the notes and I missed a couple, and he goes, no, it's like this. And then he said it, and he explained the formula to me. He says it goes up in a set of fourths, it shifts up a whole step and then comes down in the set of fourths. And I was like, oh wow, I was like excited, and he had a big smile on his face. He's like, yeah, pretty neat, huh? And and we were both just sort of like admiring Flo and Eddie's ability to nail that complex melody. So it was, right away we were sort of like connecting on that sort of, like obviously we were both fans of his music, and sort of in awe of the technical side of it. So yeah, he was, and then he at one point he asked me to play G-Spot Tornado. And I said, actually, I haven't learned that one, and it's too much for me to try to play it. But I did learn Night School off of that album. And he's like, oh, and Bob Rice, who was the synclavier technician, was also in the studio. And so Frank said to Bob, go grab me the sheet music for the melody of Night School. So Bob went and scrounged up the score and brought it back to Frank. And Frank sat in a chair reading the score, and then he just like nodded at me. He says, okay, start. And so I'm just playing Night School with no groove. I'm not playing it to the record. I'm not playing it to a beat. So that was a little bit daunting, just trying to keep the arrangement straight in my head while I'm just playing the melody by myself. But I played the whole 4-minute melody or whatever it is, and he's just sitting there quietly reading the score with me. And then when it's done, he looked up and said, "What did he say?" He said, "There was 2 wrong notes."
Did you get
And
that right next time?
that's exactly. We'll get them next time. And I happen to know there were more than 2 wrong notes. And but then later on, I heard Frank doing an interview about it, maybe the same interview that you heard, and he had revised it to say that I think he either said that I had 1 wrong note or no wrong notes, and I think he was just being kind.
Well, you should never like spoil a good story with facts.
I'm all about that. I agree.
I remember I saw like that one recent interview of yours. There was actually there were 2 like really funny stories about the covers that you played. There was that like Murder by Numbers and then Stairway to Heaven.
Well, Murder by Numbers wasn't planned. Murder by Numbers only happened because Sting started singing it. We didn't even know he was going to do it. We were playing Stolen Moments, and Frank had invited Sting to come out on stage and just improvise vocally, and Sting had no idea what he was going to do. In fact, at one point I was backstage with Sting. The only 2 people in the dressing room were me and Sting, and he was like pacing the room, really nervous, really sort of. He said, I'm terrified. I have no idea what the hell I'm going to do when I go out there with you guys." And I said, I think you'll be fine. Frank had suggested to him that he just do some scat singing, some improvised jazz singing, but he had been doing that Jimmy Swaggart routine on Murder by Numbers on his own tour. And I think he just realized that Murder by Numbers is kind of a basic sort of a blues progression. And obviously Murder by Numbers is as well, and that he could fit the melody over what we were playing. And it was a brilliant, choice for Sting to do that. Sorry to derail it, but I just want to let you know that wasn't like a cover we rehearsed. But Frank was, he was way into cover songs, especially the Beatles stuff on that tour. I think that he just felt that audiences would be really surprised to hear Frank Zappa playing that stuff, and he was right. And then Stairway to Heaven. And Stairway to Heaven was funny because Frank, he asked us at rehearsal, because at rehearsal he would just like reel off names of different cover songs to hear what it would sound like. He was sort of using us as a jukebox, and sometimes he wouldn't know even how the song went. And in the case of Stairway to Heaven, he knew that it was an iconic rock anthem. He understood the sociological power of Stairway to Heaven, but he barely knew the song. As we were playing it, he was going, "I don't even know if I've heard this before." And then it got to this guitar solo, which is just A minor G F over and over and over again. And he's going, "Man, this is," because initially we obviously hadn't done the thing yet where we were doing the solo in unison. Frank was just trying to play improvised solos over the chords. And he's going, A minor G F. What a miserable chord progression. That's totally uninspiring. He's just like, he wasn't happy just playing the solo in Stairway to Heaven. And that's how it eventually developed that actually at rehearsal, when Frank wasn't there, because sometimes we would rehearse and Frank wouldn't be there yet, and Scott Tunis would run the rehearsal in Frank's absence. And one afternoon we were running Stairway to Heaven, and I was playing the solo off the record because I had learned it when I was a teenager. And Paul Carmen, alto sax, Paul Carmen, after or during a break in rehearsal, he came to me and said, "Can you show me the notes in the guitar solo? I think it would be cool if we played it in unison." And so I showed Paul how to play the notes of the solo, and then the next time Frank came in to rehearsal and he called the tune, when it got to the solo section, Frank was starting to launch into a solo, and then me and Paul Carmen just started playing Jimmy Page's solo in unison. And Frank was playing, and then we started, and he just took his hands off the guitar and turned around and looked at us, because it's a little bit bold of us to just play over his solo. But he was listening to us do Jimmy Page's solo, and then it got to the end, And we started going into the next section, and Robert started singing, and Frank was like, no, 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 stop. Wait a second. And he just goes, okay, show it to the rest of the horn section. So so we took, about a half hour, and just spoke all of the notes in the guitar solo so that the rest of the horn guys could write it down. And then that's how we ended up with the arrangement that you hear on the record. I'm not mixed very loud, but I'm actually playing the solo along with all five guys in the horn section there. And then with the Beatles stuff, originally we were just going to do that medley straight. In fact, at one show, I think we did do it straight, where we just played, what is it? It's Lucy in the Sky, Norwegian Wood, and Strawberry Fields. We just played a medley of those three songs just because Frank liked the songs, and he just wanted to freak people out. But then when the Jimmy Swaggart thing hit, he just decided, and during one rehearsal, he just stood on stage and just out of his head wrote all of the lyrics to all those Beatle parodies on that medley. And it's funny, he was speaking the words, and my wife at the time, Viv, was visiting me on tour, and she was out at the soundboard writing down all the words as Frank was composing them. And I still have those lyric sheets that she wrote. And Bolero, obviously that was just a beautiful melody that Frank really respected, but it was also iconic, in the same way that Stairway to Heaven was iconic. And yeah, because I was always a fan as much as I was a member of the band, I looked at it as, if I was in the audience seeing these shows with this unexpected cover material, I'd be just blown away and really excited about it. I think that most fans received it that way.
Can I have another question, Mikko,
Yes.
or do we have time?
Mikko, is he loud? Yes, there is time.
Yeah. Well, I've always been very astonished, as I think all of us have been, with these compositions, of which some are extremely complicated and have, very developed counterpoint, even in the classical sense. You mentioned G-spot Tornado, that might be one of those songs. How many of you actually did have classical training in music, and was that needed, or how did you feel about these kinds of compositions, which were more towards classical stuff?
Well, I mean, how I felt about it was I loved it. That was when I was a teenager. That I think that was the stuff that excited me the most. Although the combination of that with just the powerful rock stuff, and the jazzier stuff, and the filth of the lyrics, and just the surrealism of it, and the artwork, and all of it just combined to be this unbelievable thing. But you always knew, because you would hear him do those type of compositions, you always knew that it was possible that at any moment things could just start going apeshit musically. And that was always really exciting. And I always loved that stuff. Sometimes it took a while to understand some of the music, but like Uncle Meat, the first time I heard it, it was almost like, encountering a civilization that you didn't speak their language yet. But over time, I really loved it. And that Roxy band, the way that band would play stuff like Echidnas or Bebop Tango or Tamersha Douine or any of that stuff, I really loved that music. So I was ready for it, but I wasn't trained to do it at all. I didn't have any kind of classical training. I was self-taught on guitar, and I had pop organ lessons when I was really young. So all of that stuff I just learned about from listening to records, most of which were Frank's. But there were other guys in the band who definitely had classical training. Certainly the Fowlers, and Robert was conservatory trained, and Ed was certainly university trained, and Scott, Scott is like in some ways the most musically literate person I've ever met. And he definitely spent a lot of time, studying Mahler scores and all of that, So there was a deep, and obviously Chad was really trained. Uh, so there was a deep core of that in the band, which allowed somebody like me, who was just like a huge fan, who forced himself to learn how to play a bunch of this stuff. You know, I learned a lot from those guys. I learned a lot from Scott in particular, because I was his ally in the band as when things started to go dark, and we would spend a lot of time at the hotel, and he would play me cassettes of his favorite classical pieces, and he would conduct them as we were, you know, listening, and he would, you know, explain things and give me backstory, and I got, you know, basically a semester of you know, serious music theory and history from being on the road with Scott Tunis. So I think obviously it really helped those guys having that type of solid grounding musically, because if those guys are playing the Black Page, they're playing the numbers of it, the mathematics of it exactly correctly. Whereas when I got in the band, when I taught myself how to play the Black Page, I learned it from listening to Zappa in New York and attempting to play what I was hearing. So what I was doing was playing to a sound, and I wasn't playing to the math of it. So when I started attempting to play that stuff in unison with a bunch of guys who knew the math of it and were able to, you know, execute it accurately every time, I had to fucking really grow up really fast in public. It wasn't easy. The first time I played with the group in rehearsal, you know, because I went in on Saturday for the audition. Frank said, come back on Monday and play with the rest of the band. And then that was the hard part. That was the hard audition. You know, I got along really well with Frank when I came in just to audition for him, and he made me feel at ease. And it was clear that when he would ask me to play something and I played it, that he got a kick out of it. So, you know, we connected. But then when the 2 days later, when I had to play with the whole band, in some ways impressing the band was a lot harder, especially Scott Tunis, who is like not the type of person who's going to spend a lot of time trying to help someone who doesn't know what they're doing. You know, if he's not impressed with what someone has to offer, especially someone who's supposedly in the band now, he's not necessarily going to be the most generous. We, you know, the moment that I met Scott Tunis is when he skateboarded into this room, and his head was shaven at the time, so it just looked like somebody from Full Metal Jacket. And he skateboarded up to me. He said, "Who the hell are you?" And I said, "Well, I'm Mike Keneally." And he goes, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, you know, Frank just hired me to play in the band." And he goes, "Oh God!" And he skateboards away. And then he skateboards back, and he goes, "Do you know how to play Tamershi Duin?" And I said, "No." And he goes, "Jesus!" And he skateboards away. And you know, I knew the song, but it hadn't been released officially at that point. So here's, you know, the mental gymnastics I was going through. I didn't know if Scott, you know, was like testing to see if I was familiar with bootlegs. Like maybe he was, you know, the guy in the organization who would see if anybody had illicit Zappa material. You know, that wasn't the case, but I was so new and so nervous that I felt like I just jumped to the most paranoid conclusion. But anyway, he skateboarded away, and I started, you know, quietly on an unamplified guitar, picking out the melody to Tamershi Duin, because I knew it, but I had never played it. And he's about 200 yards away, and he hears me, you know, over a studio full of people talking. He hears me playing it unamplified, and he screams, "You know it!" And then he comes skateboarding back, and like rapid fire naming the notes, or actually the fret positions. He was saying like first string 7th fret, first string 8th fret, first string 10th fret, you know, just giving me the positions of the notes right away. And then, you know, he stood there for like 10 minutes dictating the melody to me. So, you know, he was testing me. He was seeing what was up. But anyway, I've just been talking. I don't even remember precisely what you asked. I'm sorry.
Well, it doesn't matter. It's like, you know, I've done a lot of interviews, and that's already like, that's what I always hear when there's really good stuff coming. Well, I'm sorry, I forgot the question, but it's like, it's the best.
It was about classical training. Yeah. Well, I mean,
yeah.
it's a rich topic. It leads in many different directions.
Actually, you could tell what you told me about when talking about Scott Tunis, about that Sex and Religion opening concert. It was really funny what you told about Scott Tunis opening the concert.
Oh, you mean when I saw him and he was reading the newspaper stories?
Yeah.
I mean, I showed up. Steve had invited me to the Sex and Religion show, and I show up and I see in the box office window there's a little sign that says, Vi, the starting times for the different bands, and I don't remember what band was opening, but it shows Vi's starting time, the opening band starting time, and then it says 7:30 Tunis, and I was like, what? Scott Tunis is opening the show. What the hell? And then and I go in the room, in the venue, and there's a table set up on stage and like a glass of water and some newspapers. And Scott walks out on stage and sits in the chair and he picks up the newspaper and just starts reading news stories to the audience. And they were all these sort of like a lot of alternative weekly newspapers will have like news of the weird, or just like funny headlines or funny little news stories, of some bizarre thing that has happened in real life. So Scott was a fan of this column, which would just provide these little paragraphs of weird events, strange human interest things, and just freakish things that have happened. And he asked Steve if he could do an opening set of just sitting on stage reading these things to the audience. So this is an LA rock and roll audience, and a lot of people, in leather and studs, and they're looking for a rockin' good time. And here's Scott Tunis smoking clove cigarettes and reading these weird stories. And some people were laughing, but it was just like, it wasn't like a stand-up comedy club. It was a big rock venue, and it wasn't really going over. And some people in the audience started yelling at Scott, and they didn't realize that he was Scott. They don't know who Scott Tunis is. And if Scott didn't introduce himself, he didn't say, "Hi, I'm Scott Tunis. I play bass in Steve Vai's band tonight. How are you doing?" He just sat down and started reading this shit, and so people were heckling him, and little by little Scott started turning more into himself. And this one guy in the audience I think Scott wanted to provoke a hostile reaction. That's really what it was about. It's a little performance art event. And one of the guys in the audience yells out, "Go home." And then Scott goes, "If I go home, there won't be a show tonight, asshole." And and then this is like the mid December 1993, right? So that's when we did this show, and or that's when Vi did the show, and so Frank had just passed, and so this is like a week and a half later, and some guy in the audience, while in the middle of Scott reading a story, a guy in the audience yells, "Frank Zappa!" And Scott like leans into the microphone and he goes, "Oh, I'm sorry, he won't be here tonight. He's dead." and which, this is a week and a half later, so most people would say too soon, but that's Scott Tunis for you, and Frank would have laughed harder than anybody else at that, So, yeah. That's the story of Scott Tunis's opening act with Steve Vai. It was good.
Well, any other questions?
Yes, I was wondering what kind of drugs were you taking when you were playing, but then when you said like 40 hours a week of rehearsal, I guess there is not much room for drugs on that.
Well, I was very clean at the time anyway. The only drugs I was doing was beer. Which that none of that would be taking place during the rehearsal anyway. And I know that Scott Tunis functions really well on beer, so he might have been having a beer or two during dinner break. And I can't speak to what people in the band may or may not have been doing, but it didn't occur to me certainly at the time, because I was just, my drug was being in Frank Zappa's band at that point. There really wasn't anything else I could do that would satisfy me as much as that. And I also knew obviously that Frank took a real dim view of drugs. So I didn't want to upset him. So there wasn't really a question about it in my mind.
Yeah.
What is your favorite song?
My favorite song by Frank?
Yeah.
Definitely. Broken Hearts Are for Assholes. What are yours?
Is it that your favorite is Broken Hearts Are for Assholes?
Yeah.
It's a great song, and I remember actually the first time I heard that song was at the first Frank Zappa show I ever went to, which was September 1977. So that was the band with Adrian and Terry, the Baby Snakes band. I saw that band at San Diego State University in San Diego, and that was right at the very beginning of the tour. So that was the first time I ever heard "Broken Hearts Are for Assholes." First time I heard "Trying to Grow a Chin." First time I heard Punky's Whips, and the Black Page, all of this stuff. That the first time I ever experienced it was at this concert, and I really remember "Broken Hearts Are for Assholes" at that show, especially when he was just like pointing to everybody, going, "You're an asshole, and you're an asshole." I thought that's the best thing I've ever seen at a concert. But my favorite single Zappa recording is I always love the song "The Idiot Bastard Song," "Idiot Bastard Son." I think that's a very beautiful song. But especially there's a version on the compilation album Mother Mania, which Frank put together himself, and there's some unique mixes on that album. And the version of "Idiot Bastard Son" that Frank mixed for Mother Mania, that it doesn't have this spoken part in the middle, which sort of like interrupts the song intentionally on "We're Only in It for the Money." But the version on Mother Mania doesn't have that. So it's just the whole 3-minute song uninterrupted. And it's a different mix with more flutes in it. And I think it's at a different tape speed also. So it feels different. And it's just a haunting song. It's a beautiful song. And that recording of it, that mix of it is my favorite.
All right.
Thank you.
Nice. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Would you like to tell something about your new upcoming record?
Oh, it's just that, and it's taking me forever to finish it. It's
We are ready for that.
It's my it's my pandemic album, and I believe that when I finish the album, that the pandemic will officially stop. So I'm really trying to finish it quickly. But I'm very happy that Miko, that you decided you wanted to make some films about the songs on the record. I'm really happy about that, and I haven't put out an album in a few years, so I'm very excited to present this one, and I'm very happy with it. It's just taking me a long time because I'm doing it myself here at home, and it's the first time I've done a record this way. But we'll get it. We'll get it out there eventually. I was hoping to put it out in March, but I think I'll be lucky to get it out that soon. But I really expect it to come out in the first half of next year, and please wish me luck.
I have still one more question, just a small question.
Sure.
What do you think is the legacy of Frank Zappa? Is there still room for that kind of quirky and surreal music in this world, or is that something that is just for maybe small groups of people who like this more quirky stuff?
No, I think that there is some really freakish music being made nowadays. I hear quite a bit of music. There's an artist named Namdi. I don't know if you're familiar with him. Let me check the spelling. And obviously there's a lot of artists that I could recommend. It's Nnamdi. Nnamdi, Namdi. But also you listen to Kendrick Lamar's music, or there's this woman named Tierra Whack who is doing some amazing, really peculiar, really unpredictable things. And what I'm finding is that people, because of the ridiculous technology that's available nowadays to make music with, you find some people, and it's always been this way. It was this way with analog tape as well. Some people use the machinery in a way that's not particularly creative, and then other people use that same technology and they just go nuts. And I think that a lot of the people, Flying Lotus is somebody who's is doing amazing work as a producer, a modern producer, and he was influenced by Gentle Giant, and he had asked me about Zappa and like what Zappa I would recommend. And I told him the Roxy performances. I said, if you really want to hear pure Zappa music, I think that's as close as you can get. And there's a real interest, I think, in what Frank is doing. And I think as anytime there's artists who are doing something unusual and unpredictable and really idiosyncratic and true to themselves, eventually a lot of people will look towards Frank. Frank still has a name that people recognize. I still think that the word Zappa has impact in the culture, and that eventually somebody who's interested in different kinds of music will research and seek him out. And this movie, I think it has helped a lot. That movie has had a real prominent position on streaming platforms, and it just kind of, the picture of Frank sort of inserted itself into your consciousness with that film. So stuff like that. Yeah, I don't see his influence